everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for episode 1 of season 6 of the Revise and Resubmit podcast. That's right. Woohoo! I'm Dr. Kim Bissell, the Southern Progress Endowed Professor in Magazine Journalism and the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Communication and Information Sciences at the University of Alabama.
And I'm Dr. Annalisa Volin, an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies, also at the University of Alabama. And we both work in the Institute for Communication and Information Research, or the ICIR, at UA.
Today, we're catching up with one of our previous guests in the 4th of our What's New series. And that's how we're kicking off season 6. Today, we are catching up with Dr. Matt VanDyke, an associate professor in the Department and Public Relations, as well as the newly appointed Interim Department Chair of Advertising and Public Relations. He didn't have either one of those titles when we talked to him 2 years ago.
That's right. So when we last talked to Matt, we were all still on lockdown and we were recording from separate spaces across town, and sometimes we still do that. Matt was talking with us about the work that he does in science communication. There was some talk about fracking. I think that we were both like, what's he doing in communication? And we're trying to figure out these words and these terms, and he did like bring it back around to communication. And today he fills us in on all of the work, well, not all of the work, but a lot of the work that he's been doing in the past 2 years since we spoke to him last.
That's right. So needless to say, he's been pretty busy, especially with this new administrative gig that he's taken on. But before we get into our conversation with Matt, let's give you a little bit of a roundup since we are officially kicking off season 6 today. So since we started this podcast, we have aired 90 episodes. 90! That's not too bad at all. For other stats about this podcast, we have an average of 74 listens per episode. At least one episode has been downloaded in 14 different countries. Yay for that. So that means people physically in the countries, 14 different countries, have downloaded at least one. And the most downloaded episode takes us all the way back to season 1 when we were all on lockdown, when we got to speak with Dr. Keenan Brown, also from Advertising and Public Relations, about reputation management, image repair, and athletes. There's so much more that we could tell you about this podcast and our statistics, but we don't want to take away too much time from our conversation with our very first guest of the season.
All right, so we are going to catch up with Matt about the topic of science and risk and communication and more. And without further ado, let's welcome Matt VanDyke.
Welcome, Matt. As we start season 6 of this podcast, we are kicking off with the 4th in our What's New with series, and we are thrilled to be able to catch up with Dr. Matt VanDyke. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to come back.
Oh, yes. That gets me thinking. Before we even get into that, you are one of our favorite. No, we can't say that. We're not supposed to say you're one of our favorites. It's always just so good.
So much fun.
Yeah.
So much fun.
So getting into it, Matt, your first test is we're going to start out with a couple of questions. Don't think too hard. These are easy about you. So Tell us a little bit about yourself first. Where are you from?
Originally, I'm from the southwestern tip of Virginia, not to be confused with West Virginia. And I know most people don't care about that, but I do. It's a little town called Rowe, Virginia. If you're so inclined to Google that, there's one red light. It's very close to Bristol, Tennessee, Bristol, Virginia, that tip of Virginia that's very close to West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina. That's the part of the world that I'm from.
Nice. And what is it that you do now?
A lot of things. Most recently, I'm Interim Department Chair of Advertising and Public Relations as of November, which has been a fun challenge, an exciting challenge. The other part of my job is I'm an associate professor of public relations in the department. And what that consists of is primarily teaching undergraduate, master's, and PhD level courses, primarily related to public relations, but also related to public engagement with science, environment, and risk, which ties into the research part of my position as well.
And we're going to hear all about that. However, we always have one more fun question.
Okay.
What did the young Matt want to be when he grew up? Did you want to be a professor?
You know, what's interesting is I actually was thinking about this. I know that the fall semester is over, and I was on my way to work. I was thinking, what did I want to do? This is actually very timely. And it turns out when I was first, in grade school and so forth, I originally wanted to be a science teacher, and I wanted to drive a school bus, and I wanted to coach football. And I actually did do a brief stint driving a school bus, and thought I was going to coach football. And when I got into science courses in college, I thought, I really like science, but I don't like the specifics. I just like talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So it just happened that now I figure out how we can better engage the public with science rather than the nuance and the technical specifics.
You are like wise, like you had a vision. And I mean, I don't know anything really about coaching football, but I imagine being a department chair is similar.
Oh yeah, calling audibles, the whole thing.
Yeah, strategy. With very public relations of me too. It's all about strategy, and I have a soft spot. I'm very passionate about the offensive line, which everybody likes, the quarterback or the wide receiver who catches the passes. You live or die by your offensive line.
Yes, absolutely.
If the folks up front aren't creating the pocket, you're not going anywhere. So
okay, so I feel like we could put you on the spot and ask you to give us the positions of your team.
Mm-hmm.
But we won't do that.
Next question.
All right, Matt. So when we last talked to you, which was, it was like last week, but when we last had you on the podcast, it was over 2 years ago, and we talked a lot about fracking, and I think we had you give us a definition. But the huge big takeaway from that conversation was that you told us about communication barriers that exist when communicating information about science and the environment. So what's you been up to related to that these past 2 years?
I've been up to a lot, as we all have for the past 2 years. But that core question of how to overcome barriers to public engagement has remained constant, which is a good thing. But my work has tended to shift a little bit more squarely on the water space and the natural disaster space too. So I've been fortunate that some of the grant proposals that I've submitted and teams that I've been a part of for the past couple of years, we've been fortunate enough to be awarded funding.
Whoop, whoop.
A lot of yay! And so there are 3 in particular that are getting ready to kick off or have kicked off recently. And so I can tell you a little bit about those and how barriers relate to those. So one is funded by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as part of the Alabama Water Institute, University of Alabama Cooperative Institute that was recently awarded. And I'm collaborating with a professor in geography to basically figure out how people in the southeastern United States seek out and think or perceive risk related to drought, water availability, and flooding. And so more focused on water quantity. And what we're doing there is the geographer is going to map out, they've got a cool way to, and I'm sorry that I can't be more scientific with how I explain a really cool way to map out social vulnerability to this type these types of risks. And so right now, Dr. Shao and her grad student are, going through and creating maps to figure out where social vulnerability exists related to these risks. I'm going to come in later, and once we identify those places, we're going to go into communities that are socially vulnerable, and we're going to do interviews and focus groups with both officials of this type of risk information and also community members to see on both sides, from the official standpoint when you're communicating to the public, and then you're a member of the public also trying to hopefully seek out this information, understand this information. So we're trying to take a more holistic look at where communication and information barriers exist, and make recommendations in terms of, whether it's official communication or more bottom-up, organic type of information seeking and communication with other folks, where those gaps exist and where we can make recommendations. Similar to that, there's a Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant that we've just been awarded, and that context is related to severe weather events along the Mississippi and Alabama Gulf Coast. And we're doing a few different, we'll have about 3 different phases on that project. One is a social media analysis to kind of see what types of discourse emerge around specific weather events leading up to the event, during the event, and then shortly after the event, to see how discourse kind of evolves over time. And we're also going to do a similar thing where we have interviews and focus groups with officials and members of the public to kind of see what barriers exist in terms of risk information seeking and processing there. The third grant that I'm on, actually with Dr. Steve Holliday, and also it's being led by one of our colleagues, Amanda Coe, over in chemical engineering. She is super brilliant, and she has this really cool way of she's going to develop a type of foam that basically filters out water contaminants better than what else exists. And, I know that's a very general way to explain that, but that's my understanding conceptually of it. So my piece that I can explain is that we're trying to figure out these folks who would adopt this type of technology. So this, from my understanding, this type of technology can be scaled up to an industrial level, all the way down to individual consumer level. And so for my piece of it, we're really interested in how water technology professionals, folks who manage water at an industrial scale, what factors they consider when they're adopting a new type of water quality technology, risk perceptions with that, and also just kind of the decision-making logistics associated with that. So that's in a nutshell, and I'm prioritizing the grant funding stuff because those things have deadlines, and that's very salient when you to the question you asked too. But there are other things I could talk about, but that's the most stuff right now.
So in short, you haven't really had much going on.
No. If you need me to come do something, I'm happy to help.
Okay, so Matt, I have a question here. So you talked about these different projects and they're collaborative. Like, why are you? I don't mean this to be rude, but sure. Why are you involved? So what is why can't a chemical engineer do communication studies? Why is communication essential in these different projects?
Well, I think the first time I was on the podcast, I made a statement that communication is foundational to everything going on around campus. And I've been beating that drum before this. Also, luckily, people are hopefully hearing that music. No, it's honestly, it's kind of happened organically. The thing that I really love about the university here and particularly people, I'm very involved with the Water Institute, for example, and more so than other places I've been, a lot of people just seem to understand and appreciate and crave the type of contribution that communication and information scholars can provide. They understand the necessity of communication and public engagement. You can have the coolest technology, the most robust science, but it doesn't have the type of impact that it could, or it doesn't realize its full potential if people don't understand how to interpret it or how to use it, or if you don't understand the barriers to people getting the information that you're trying to transmit to them. And so I've been very fortunate that the context in which I work, that there are people, researchers across campus who seek out that type of expertise, but also that we have institutes and facilitators in the appropriate places to help make those collaborations more accessible than they would be otherwise.
Okay, I have a follow-up, and this tends to be the way all these podcasts go. Annalise and I have 29 follow-ups. But going back to the first project that you were talking about that's funded by NOAA, where you're looking at how individuals in the southeastern part of the United States perceive risk related to water availability, flooding, drought, and all of that. You use the term social vulnerabilities, and what part of what you're doing is looking at where they exist. Can you explain to the listeners what that means, and how do you determine what social vulnerabilities exist?
Well, I think that I can identify what it means from my perspective, and I think that's a good example of the challenge and nuance with some of these types of collaborations, because even how I would, as a communication scholar who was trained and kind of thinks in terms of from a psychological perspective, risk perception and social vulnerability from a more sociological or psychological perspective. My understanding in our initial conversations with, my colleague in geography is we don't necessarily operationalize social vulnerability in the same way. My understanding of the way that they would be able to map that out would be based on social infrastructure. And again, if I'm getting that wrong, sorry. It will be accurate after you, or after we, develop this more. But that's my understanding of how, they're basically looking at publicly available data and indicators that exist through, GIS systems or other databases to determine what social vulnerability looks like, at least at like a zip code level or a community level, some type of demography type of indicators.
So Matt, I know that we talked last time about your science background, but how do you, asking for a friend here, how do you have confidence to go and talk to these geography folks, chemical engineering folks, or is it just we're all scientists, even though I may not be a natural scientist, and so the conversations are not intimidating, or are they? Or
that's a great question. I think all these questions have been great, by the way, but that's one that I haven't necessarily thought about as much. I think for me, I was put into a position as a doctoral student, but the last 2 years of my time in my PhD program, I was funded through an interdisciplinary water cluster at Texas Tech. And part of that position was me going, to the Water Institute and to other folks around campus and being, the liaison, or trying to be the liaison between, the college, what's the name of our college? I almost said Communication Information Sciences, the equivalent, the College of Media and Communication at Texas Tech, and other folks on campus. And I was naive at that point, and I shouldn't have been, because, I didn't realize that. I knew that people did advertising and journalism and so forth, but that type of career was just so foreign to me. I'm from a small community where you're pretty much a teacher, a lawyer, or a doctor, or you might work in the coal mines, or do something else, a mechanic, something like that, which is totally fun. So I didn't realize that people worked in advertising or PR, unless I figured they lived in cities or something like that, and I didn't realize how accessible a position like this could be, or how transferable a skill set in communication and information could be. I do know now. But having said that, obviously, as a PhD student, by that time you understand how useful a degree in anything that we would offer in the type of college that we're in can be. But other colleagues across campus don't necessarily understand that. There was a time early on, probably in like 2014, that I was talking to an environmental economist, and I mentioned where I'm from, and his response was, "Oh, your folks are the college. You make brochures." And I thought he was joking, and I said, "Yeah, that's all we do is we make brochures." And I started laughing, and he didn't laugh. I said, "Actually, we do a lot of theory-based research. I've never made a brochure, and you probably don't want me to, because it's pretty, but it will be strategic." And that really demonstrated to me that, even though we all exist on the same campus and we might have overlap in terms of interest or so forth, we need to do a better job of communicating what our contributions are and what they can be. So from that point forward, I've always tried to make a concerted effort wherever I am. It's not just communicating to the public, it's also communicating to folks who could be our colleagues but don't see the natural fit, or have topical overlap, and, like for my case, environment or science, but don't necessarily think of us as people who do things besides help get the message out, or us after the fact as broader impact.
So I have a follow-up question, and it's kind of a bigger picture one. As you just mentioned, the research that you do is very much theoretically driven, and it's not related to developing and creating brochures. But as you've described it, it sounds like there's really a significant impact on communities, or that there could be a significant impact on communities based on what you find. So with these 3 projects that you've described, and you can talk about any one of them, is there like the hope for an outcome that's really applied, where it's like, all right, here's what we've learned, and then you find those who do create brochures and get it into their hands or something like that?
Exactly. And I think that's my favorite part of any of these projects, is thinking about the potential impact. And it's honestly the reason why I engage in these types of projects, is because, we all, those of us who are researchers, we do a study and we can publish it in a journal and so forth. And that's impact. For me, the more intrinsic motivation is, how can I advance knowledge, but also how can I make these specific contexts a little bit better than perhaps when I first arrived. And so, so for me, and to your question, that's really why I engage in these grant proposals, for example, is because there is that community engagement requirement. And also, if you are fortunate enough to get funding, you have a budget to have more impact than you perhaps could without it. And so, to your point about brochures or whatever outreach materials or engagement materials you create, you actually do have budget items that would allow you to, based on the research that you that you produce and the results you find, you're able to make recommendations to decision makers to tell them, I know you're doing this and that's great. People appreciate it, but there seems to be an opportunity to engage on this platform,
Mm-hmm.
your messaging in this way, or to open up this type of forum or something like that. And on the flip side, obviously, decision makers are a big part of that, or officials who engage in this type of communication. And I think sorry, this is a side tangent. I think part of why it's so important is because a lot of the people in these positions who are tasked with communicating risk information or scientific information, they're oftentimes experts in the technical science or risk piece that they're overseeing, and they desire effective communication, and they want to engage the public. But and it's no fault of them or anyone like them, but they might not have expertise in communication. So I see it as our job to help them realize that there is a body of knowledge, that we're not just creating cool flashy tactics or brochures to grab people's attention, but there's a whole process that we engage in, and we can help you evaluate the effectiveness too of these different strategies, so that you're allocating resources efficiently and effectively and ethically, having the type of impact that you would want to have anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask this question, and this is not to call out anyone.
Mm-hmm.
You're a researcher.
Mm-hmm.
And do you find that either folks in a community or officials who exist within a community as well are hesitant to interact with you or hear what you have to say because you're a fancy researcher, or are people generally open and engaged with you?
At this point, I would say, to be honest, most of my research has been with decision makers and professionals who are doing this type of stuff. Obviously, the pandemic put a damper on a lot of community engagement and so forth. But typically, I think there is a hesitancy if people think that they might be identifiable. That, particularly if you're asking them stuff that's related to their job function. I've partnered with at other universities who professionals who work with another individual on campus, and they've already got a relationship. And then there's Matt VanDyke, who's cold emailing or cold calling and being like, hey, I want to talk to you about this research study. Here's an informed consent. Let me know. and I've found out, that luckily I have a relationship with that person that they've reached out to, who is also on campus. But I've heard stories of them reaching out to those folks and being like, hey, is this legit? Like, is this person going to do anything with my information? Should I participate? And they're like, yeah, this is what he does, and this is the type of stuff that he's trying to answer. And so I think people have been cautious. I won't say skeptical or hesitant, but just cautious to make sure that what the type of work I'm doing or we're doing is legit, which is fair. And but I think too, part of that is, I think when we think of a university or we think of a researcher, we might think of someone wearing a lab coat or this grand thing, this ivory tower that exists. And it's part of my mission to just make all this stuff more accessible. It's a university is really the people. Yeah, it's a place. It's the people and it's the projects and even when I conduct research with professionals or with the public, I try very hard to not be, I dress professionally, but I've tried to be perceived as just I'm Matt, and what I study, what I'm passionate about, and you're an expert too, and that's why I want to talk to you. You've got stuff to share, and otherwise we wouldn't be talking to you or get incentive and so forth. So there are no right or wrong answers, and I really appreciate and value your time. And I think that goes a long way too in helping to make people feel comfortable, and also think, you know what, yeah, I do have stuff to share, and I should feel comfortable doing that.
Absolutely. And I think that certainly crosses all the areas of research that we do. I mean, the key is if we're going into communities and talking to people, we want to present ourselves as accessible to them. And, we're not white coats, but, the experts, and we're just taking stuff from them and not considering their perspective. So thank you for sharing that.
No problem.
We are getting to the wrap up section of this podcast, and it has been so much fun hearing about what you've been doing over the last 2 years. But before we end this, we definitely want to get a few recommendations from you because, we're going to be starting a new year. People need to know what to watch, what to read, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, the important stuff.
Absolutely. So, what is your favorite TV show, or what are you watching right now that you would recommend?
Right now, because of the time of year and it's salient, Yellowstone. We've got to see what's going on with Rip and Beth. So yeah, Yellowstone. I also find myself coming home of the evening and watching the Great British Baking Show as needed.
Oh, valid.
Luckily,
Totally.
you can watch the reruns. So
Yes.
yes, I do.
Oh, same.
And football.
Okay, you have successfully answered that question. What are you reading, or what book can you recommend?
Well, the people probably aren't interested in the books that I assign for my courses. I have a stack of about 3 mystery thriller books that I'm going to hopefully read over the break. I can't remember the titles, but any good mystery thriller type of fiction book, and it seems to be the ones that take place in Europe are the ones that I'm drawn to.
Okay, that's fun.
now.
That's a recommendation.
Yeah.
What is a movie that we all need to see right now?
So a couple of lighthearted, if you just want to escape, laugh a little bit. I think the last 2 movies, my wife and I went and watched the George Clooney and Julia Roberts movie, Ticket to Paradise, I think, and The Lost City with Channing Tatum and Sandra Bullock. Those were both lighthearted and fun, if you don't want to think.
I mean,
That's where we're at.
I'm down for. All right, Matt, last question.
Yep.
Is if your life was a reality show, or if you could pick a reality show to be on, what would that be?
Easy. The Amazing Race.
Yes, I love that answer.
Yeah. You get to see so much and do cool things, and I would just need to make sure that my wife and I, as the team, she's very good at things like that, and so I would just want to make sure that I don't bring the team down. But
I think that if we should figure out how to pull off an Amazing Race submission to the actual show that is Professor Edition, because we've got a couple of teams identified.
It could be a fun study abroad proposal.
Oh, stop it right now.
Yeah.
You have gone too far, Matt.
Great communication.
I like that.
Great communication.
But I mean, you and your wife, the doctors, the white coat doctor, the professor doctor, how lovely would that be? That would be amazing.
I would tune into that for sure.
Matt, it has been so great catching up with you. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit about what you've been doing these last 2 years. This has been super fun. So thank you.
Well, thank you both again for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
Absolutely.